Welcome to PR Talk, sponsored by the PRSA of Oregon and part of the MPN, the Marketing Podcast Network. This is your host, Amy Rosenberg, founder of Veracity and author of A Modern Guide to Public Relations. Help other people find our podcast by subscribing, rating, giving us a review, or sharing on social media. Hi, everybody. I have Christine Pitawanich here. Hi, Christine.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Yeah, so if people that aren't in Portland might not know that Christine is a reporter for KGW TV, which is an NBC affiliate in Portland, Oregon. But you might actually already know her from an Emmy that she won for her investigative work on how Oregon's ICUs were overwhelmed by non-vaccinated patients. But we'll talk about that later. First, I just want to talk to Christine about everything that she reports on and what types of stories she's looking for.
Yeah, so been at KGW since 2015. Prior to that, I started out in Medford, Oregon, so Southern Oregon in 2011. So I've been doing this for a little while, more than a decade. It's kind of weird to say that,
Yeah.
hear myself say that. But prior to the pandemic, I was just a general assignment reporter. You know, you'd go in, you have your own story ideas that you would like look on Twitter for or look at the papers and you're like, hey, this is what's going on. This is what I think might be a good story, during our daily morning meetings. And then once the pandemic hit, everything kind of hit the fan and everyone went home. And at that point, I was assigned a beat. So basically, a topic or two that I, as a reporter, would consistently check up on and cover. And my beat basically was education. So since the pandemic started, I've been doing a lot of education related stories, COVID and education, and there have been no shortage. If you're a parent or a teacher or a student, like the progression of education throughout COVID and the pandemic, and there's always been something new to talk about. I've also covered a lot of the follow-up and also when it actually happened, the fires in 2020. So the, wind-driven historic wildfires of 2020, both in, the Beach Creek fire, which was Sandy Canyon, and even down south, I did a follow-up, at the Alameda fire, which is in Southern Oregon, like I said, and I've done a lot of follow-ups there as well. So, and in addition, a smattering of COVID-related stories, as you mentioned, the story about Oregon's ICUs was a huge one.
That was like 25 minutes long. That was like its own show.
Well, and that was a collaboration between myself and longtime reporter Pat Doris, who's been around the block for quite a while, like even longer than I have. He's like a legacy reporter at KGW. And also, we had an editor who was amazing, a photographer, an executive producer. So that was definitely a team effort. I went into OHSU, their ICU, and then my colleague, Pat Doris, went into the Bend ICU. I can't remember the name of the actual hospital. It's eluding me, but yeah.
So then what was that situation like? And do you think you'll do more reporting on that? Or are you kind of just like, really focused on education now?
I've always been focused on education. It just so happened that, it was kind of like people were talking about it. And it's like, hey, this is an opportunity for us to go into an ICU and see what the impact is. Because at that time, it was during the Delta wave. And if anybody's been, paying attention to the waves in the pandemic, that was a really, really hard one and deadly for people who were unvaccinated as well. And I mean, people who were vaccinated too. But if you saw the story, you'd see that the vast majority of the people who were in the ICU hooked up to machines that were circulating their blood and keeping them alive, they were unvaccinated. And it was taking a toll on the medical system, on families, on doctors and nurses. So I mean, at that point, it was so important to get their voices out there because there was so much misinformation, being shared on Facebook and social media. And so we felt it was that much more important to hear from the nurses and the health professionals themselves, like, hey, this is real, this is happening, this is going on. And yeah, I think we'll continue to do follow-ups on the situation. I mean, at this point, we're in a wave that is very virulent, so very transmissible, COVID is. But if you're vaccinated and boosted and all that, it seems, from what I've heard anyway, and through mutual friends that have gotten COVID recently, because it's spread so quickly. This strain, it seems for a lot of people to be more mild. So we're
Oh, okay.
obviously hoping
Well,
that continues to be the case.
maybe you can clear up some possible misinformation. But yesterday, I heard on the street that you can get this new wave outside. Like you can just like randomly catch it outside. I don't know if that's even true, but
I am not a medical
yeah,
professional,
yeah.
but all I know is that, in a number of counties in Oregon where, the risk is high now because of the transmissibility, the CDC and health professionals have recommended that people wear masks indoors again. And as we all know, Oregon lifted its mask mandate a number of months ago, it's not a mandate now, but it's a recommendation. And I mean, as to your point about it being transmissible outside, I can't speak to that. I haven't heard that. And I've mainly been covering a lot more education stories. So I haven't been like in the nitty gritty talking to medical professionals every day. Um, but I mean, I guess it depends on the source and who said it too. So.
Well, my husband. So,
Oh,
so, but speaking of, just the changing nature of the pandemic, how has your education reporting evolved with the changing nature? Because I'm sure that's really hard to keep up with and to trend spot and track.
yeah, I wouldn't say it's hard to keep up with. I mean, it has been a progression. In the beginning, nobody really knew what was happening. Everybody
Mm-hmm.
got sent home, kids got sent home. There were hiccups with, technology. Some students couldn't log on. Maybe their Wi Fi hotspot wasn't working or their laptop was not, up to date or working either. It was definitely a progression over time, because then you had, slowly trickling in some limited in-person instruction. What was that going to look like for families and kids, as some students headed back, the most in need students, those who needed more help and hands-on. And, then masking was a huge issue that came up. A lot of parents on both sides, some really, really believing that they shouldn't have to mask their kids, and others who are really believing they should. And, just a lot of stuff has happened. And I think that as a reporter who's been on a beat, you really start to, because you talk almost every day to teachers or parents, administrators in school districts, you start to really get a handle on what the big issues are at that moment. And I mean, as you talk to people, other issues start popping up that maybe they'll mention, sidebar. And then you're like, oh,
Mm-hmm.
okay, maybe that's something I should look into next. And what's interesting is, yeah, it just never felt like there was a shortage of, oh, that's maybe something I should look into next. And it's kind of interesting because now we're, 2+ years into this pandemic, and it still feels, I mean, now it's kind of slowing down a little bit, especially because it's summer and the students are out. But I'd say, over the last 2 years, there's really been no shortage, like I said, of stories that were education related.
Well, yeah, and it's important even without the pandemic. I mean, we're educating our future leaders, so we should be looking into it. And the public should listen and just know what's going on. I mean, you could talk about so many things like staffing and
Hmm.
leadership, how that's going down. And we were just wondering, as I was brainstorming with my colleague, Kaylin, who asked you to be on our podcast, she was just wondering, are there more hurdles when investigating schools in terms of what you might say? I might call it bureaucracy, or we
Yeah,
might not call it that. I don't know.
I would say the hurdles come trying sometimes to get a clear answer from districts, because obviously, like districts, they don't want to look bad, they're trying their best as well to educate students. I mean, they probably wouldn't be in the business of education if they didn't care about educating students. But sometimes, and this is the case, I think, with any party that may be criticized for something, getting a straight answer, like, I know that this is what parents are saying, what's actually happening, without getting the runaround or getting, kind of a beat around the bush type of answer. But you can kind of glean typically from like a district official response, kind of what's going on. Of course, I can't add, what I think necessarily, unless, there's a lot of evidence or proof showing otherwise or something. I let the people who are bringing the criticism, like the parents or the teachers, they're the ones that do the talking. I'm not the one who, kind of extrapolates from what a district says or doesn't say. And as for like teachers, they're a lot of teachers are worried and anxious about speaking out. Like they may have a lot of concerns that they think, the public and the community should know about. And they may contact me and say, hey, this is something that's happening and I think you should look into it. But it can be difficult to have said teacher who contacted me also be willing to speak to me on the record, on camera, whether that's Zoom or in person now, because they're worried about repercussions and blowback, and they're not sure if their union would be okay with that. So I mean, those are the types of hurdles I would say that I've encountered as I've covered education, is teachers that have very valid concerns, but are, worried about losing their job or worried about being kind of like blacklisted and shunned by, or somehow getting some repercussion. And then the
Mm-hmm.
districts, you know, I find that the districts that I've worked with have been very good at getting back to me with an answer. But just, sometimes it hasn't been as direct or, as I would like sometimes. But I mean, that is what it is when, they're doing their best and they don't want to look a certain way to the community.
Yeah, and we have been in hard times when we just haven't been sure about what's going to happen
Mhm.
with
Things
the
are changing
pandemic.
all the time. So that's another thing that I was told often. Like, well, things are changing. The information that I'm giving now, I mean, it could be different tomorrow, especially at the height of the pandemic.
Yeah. So are there any new trends that you might be seeing in education now, or is that hard to ask because it's summer? So,
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to know because like you said, it's summer, and I think it really depends on what happens with COVID. I mean, right now, kids are out of school and it's, a pretty transmissible, but, at least the last time I saw anyway, it was relatively mild for a lot of people, although some do have, pretty intense, reactions as well. And still there are long haul COVID, people people struggling with long haul COVID for sure. But yeah, I think it depends on what happens with the pandemic. I mean, masking will, probably still be a thing. I mean, some maybe I have no idea. I mean, like I said, it kind of just depends. At the end of the school year, near the end of the school year, I know a lot of districts, as the mask mandate was lifted in Oregon, also said, hey, yeah, masks are optional. So,
yeah. And now we're only halfway through the summer, which is kind of a long time. We still have until September. So a lot could change. So let me ask how PR people could help you in your process, whether you're reporting on education or fires or anything. Or how
um,
could we, or the flip side of that is how could we hinder and or annoy you?
um, I would say, and I mean, not to like focus on my gripes first,
No,
but
it's fine. We want to hear it.
Um, I appreciate when PR folks, send me emails. I definitely appreciate when it's a local pitch, because if it's
Hmm.
somewhere like in Ohio or California even, like I am way less likely, unless there is an Oregon connection or a Washington connection, then I'm way less likely to cover it because we're a local TV station, so we deal with local issues. But then also, if I do get an email from someone about a local issue or something that's happening locally, it makes my life so much easier if there is someone, like a person who is directly impacted, or the person who is, specifically doing whatever it is the event is about, on tap, on call, to be available to do an interview via Zoom or in person. And for TV news in particular, we are under massive deadlines every single day. So if this person, the PR person who's trying to facilitate an interview, if they are unable to get an interview in the like an hour or two, it's like we have to move on to something else
Mm-hmm.
because we have
Mm-hmm.
such tight deadlines. So like if I come in to the office at 9 or 9:30, I see an email, I reach out to the PR person, I get a response from them by like 10, I'm going to need an interview like ready to go in like 2 hours tops. Like that's what I want.
Mm-hmm.
And if I can't get
Mm-hmm.
that, then I'm going to have to say, hey, maybe we do it for another day. And the thing with that is that maybe the other day won't come depending on how
Mm-hmm.
timely this event is. If it's happening today, you got to do it today, or unless something else big happens tomorrow with it or something, and
Mm-hmm.
that's another thing, timeliness. You know, I would encourage anyone, whether they're a PR person or just someone in the community, if they want people in the news world, reporters, to know about something, email like a week out, email a few days out, and then email day of, just in case if you haven't even heard from them. But like that way you can kind of get put on the radar, and at least, you know, maybe start being in contact a week out, or if you're fortunate enough, and that, or like a few days out, like, hey, what can we do? And that way the PR person, if there is a reporter that's interested, can will have been able to facilitate the interview and kind of make both parties happy, because often people outside of news are like, whoa, 2 hours, like in an hour, like like, what am I supposed to say? Like, I have to get ready. But that's just the truth of our deadlines. We reach out, we hope that somebody gets back to us within an hour or two for an interview, and then if not, we move on to somebody else.
Yeah,
So
well, so PR people just need to prep their clients and say, hey, if you want me to do this, you need to be ready, like the day that I send it out. And
especially
then
if
I
it's a
guess,
TV news story, yeah.
yeah. And then I guess you're also saying it's not all about our clients, it's about who is impacted. So that might be the public, like a family at a school or a child or a vendor or something like that, right?
As a reporter, you know, I'm definitely more apt, if I had two stories that I'm looking at, one affects like one person and then the other one affects a whole segment of the population, I am more likely to try to go for the story that impacts more people, because that's kind of, that's what we do. It's like we try to be a service to as many people as we can, in news, in local news. And the more people it impacts, the more likely I am probably going to try to facilitate or reach out on that story. And that's not to say that I won't reach out on the other story. I'm just more likely to maybe first reach out on, the story that has the most impact, on the community. Whether that's the business community, whether that's like our local business community, the Black community, LGBTQ plus community, communities of people, Oregonians, even.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Just general
yeah,
Oregonians.
but like I
Mm-hmm.
said, I mean, even if that other story pitch, impacted one family, if that family is willing to talk to me, people connect with people. So if the
Mm-hmm.
family that's impacted is willing to share their story, and it's a story that people will connect with, then yeah, then I'm definitely open to that as well.
Yeah. So how often would you cover higher education and colleges and
Honestly, I mean, I've done mostly like elementary, high school coverage throughout the pandemic, but I've had a smattering of higher education. Um, and I mean, it kind of depends on what comes up in higher education. I mean, if you have an example, I could definitely, like, hey, if there's a story about this, like, what are your thoughts on it? I could give you my thoughts. But I mean, I guess the likelihood of me covering higher education is probably similar to me covering any other kind of education related story. It kind of depends on what's happening in the news. Like if like a newspaper does something, and I'm like, oh, whoa. For instance, the Wall Street Journal did a story about the U of O recently, and there was some outside company that was teaching a course that kind of piggybacks and like is in partnership with U of O and advertises as kind of a U of O course. And so somebody, a student, was like, oh, this is a U of O course. I want to, you know, register for this course. And they didn't know that there was another entity that was actually teaching the course. That was a story that was in the Wall Street Journal. And I was like, oh, how interesting. That's a local story that a national publication um, published. And so I thought, oh, how interesting. And I forwarded it to my manager. I said, hey, take a look at this. So, I mean, I think it's just kind of depending on what's happening, what other news outlets have reported, but also what tips we've gotten from either staff, faculty, or the school itself, or students. Kind of depends on a number of factors.
Yeah, and in general, it would make sense that you would cover the lower education because it might impact more people, and then a little bit of it is more out of our control through public schools because
Mm.
you and especially speaking of BIPOC communities, we might not be well, not we, but it might be hard to change schools. And so you're directly impacted by what's happening in your local school. Whereas at college, you are possibly making the decision to go there. So,
Mhm.
yeah. So what is your, any other kind of thoughts for, pet peeves or thoughts for PR people before I move over to my last question, which is what's the advice you'd offer to yourself when you started your career in TV broadcasting?
Hmm. I mean, the advice that I would offer myself, you can do only what you can do, and don't you can't be perfect. I mean, that's in the very beginning, you try so hard to like, you have a little script, you're going to say it, and you're like practicing, and you're like, oh, I have to say this word for word. And then you get, anxious and amped up, and you're like, am I going to be able to say this word for word? I need to say all of this like as it's written. But the truth is, be confident in what I've written, and I know the subject. And if it doesn't come out of my mouth live on camera the way that I've written it, it's fine because it'll come out in a way that, that I understand, in a way that I've understand it, the topic anyway. Um, and it's just, when I said, you can only do what you can do. I mean, sorry, that's my little alarm for my meeting that I
For
had to
your
get
meeting,
into.
your
Yeah,
meeting
but
that you have. Sorry.
I know, yeah. But really, as a reporter, so it's really easy to just get sucked into just working 24/7. I mean, my reporter brain never turns off. If I'm talking to someone at the store, they tell me something, I'm like, wow, that's probably a story that should be looked into, or wow, that'd be a really great story that somebody would, be impacted by. So my reporter brain never turns off. And sometimes it's like easy just to overwork yourself. And that's why a lot of reporters burn out too. You feel overworked. But even my mom told me, you can only do what you can do. And, sure, I try to, in my web stories, add more quotes, add more information. But at the end of the day, I can't, work 10 hours and be paid like 8 hours. I have to try to balance myself. And so that's probably what I would say to my younger self. You can do what you can
Yeah.
do. Don't be perfect. And also, I guess I'd add in there, really try for balance in your
Hmm.
personal life, because it's easy as a reporter to kind of make that your identity almost. This is who I am. This is what I care about. It's like the most important thing. And it's important, but
Mm-hmm.
personal life and balance is also important so you don't burn out. But as for PR
Yeah.
folks, I just appreciate um, any emails local, the impact that it has on the community, like the scope of impact, and what's always helpful, like I said, being ready or having the interviewee be ready to go kind of at a moment's notice, especially if you're talking about TV, because TV news people are going to want it like generally speaking, pretty soon if you're doing it that day.
Mm-hmm. Yesterday, maybe.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. This has been very helpful. And it's great to just get to know somebody that we see on TV and admire. So thank you. And I'll let you get back to your meeting.
Okay, thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for listening. For more PR insight, be sure to check out Amy's book, A Modern Guide to Public Relations, at prtalk.co. Also, please subscribe, rate, or leave us a review.